Hey everybody, it's Anna and welcome back to my booktube channel. This video is going to be my Geekly wrap-up for the week of June 15th through June 21st. This week I read 5 books, I DNF'd 1 book, I listened to 1 audiobook, and I played a video game at long last. So let's go ahead and talk about the books first. So the first book that I finished this week was White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. I read this as part of the Blackout Buddy read, which I am sure that you have heard all about by now, but just in case you haven't, all of the pertinent stuff is going to be linked down below. I ended up really enjoying is a hard word to describe this book. Well, I thought that this book was really excellent. I ended up giving it 5 out of 5 stars. It essentially demonstrates that the history of race and racism in this country is not one of Black rage in opposition to white violence, but rather one of white rage in opposition to Black excellence and Black achievement in this country. So Carol Anderson takes each chapter as a discrete period in United States history, beginning with Reconstruction and then going all the way up into the Reagan era and the sort of like demonization of Black women as these welfare queens and stuff like that. And she talks about the ways in which white rage manifests itself by becoming codified in state and local politics and within the court systems and within all of these other systems that are racist and are designed to oppress Black people, and how Black people still maintain a culture of achievement and advancement that is not defined by white oppression, but instead by Black goals and Black achievement. This book was really eye-opening for me because I had learned a lot about each of the individual little pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, when I was in school and just through reading that I've done myself. But the way that Carol Anderson kind of weaves them all together and draws different connections between like pieces of legislation and specific court cases and then their outcomes in history really like helped me to understand this as a more holistic view. And I think that the way that she frames this argument about white rage is really invaluable if you want to understand the first thing about racism in this country. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. I did end up changing my white fragility rating, which I talked about last week, to 4 out of 5 stars because the more that I thought about it, the less I felt like it was good or helpful to give an anti-racist book written by a white person 5 out of 5 stars, especially when it was a good book, but it was still very beginnery and surface level. So I didn't want to, even though I personally found the book very helpful, I didn't want to make it seem like that was the end-all be-all, like you could just read that book and that was going to be the best book that you would read about it. I think that White Rage is actually a way better book to read if you're really trying to understand how to be a better anti-racist in this country, and if you were really trying to understand American history and the court system and society through this particular lens. So really excellent book, I'd highly recommend. I DNF'd 1 Year of Ugly by Caroline McKenzie. This was a book that I had gotten as an e-arc from NetGalley. I really should have read the synopsis first that compared it to Maria Semple because I could not stand this book. I ended up having to DNF it because there was just so much stuff in it that was like really derogatory and insulting towards like almost every group that you could think of. Like, this is a white Trinidadian author writing about the refugee crisis that is taking place as a bunch of refugees are fleeing Venezuela and coming to Trinidad. And she's writing her Latinx protagonist in the most like stereotypical, over-the-top, overly sexualized way. I was like, I don't feel good about this. And then there's transphobia, there's ableism, there's like all this other stuff on the page. And I'm just like, no, we're not reading like white cis ladies writing about sexy Latina women or about, I don't even want to repeat the things that she's said because they're just really harmful and don't need to be propagated. So I gave this book 1 star. If you want to see anything more specific or in depth, I did post a review about it on Goodreads because I very rarely give out 1-star reviews, so I felt like I really needed to explain why this book was as bad as it was. But needless to say, I'm not going to be continuing with reading that. I then finished my 3rd book for the Make Your Myth Taker readathon, and that was House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. This was a 2-star book for me. This is supposed to be a retelling of the fairy tale of the 12 Dancing Princesses. which is really barely there. Like, it's kind of tangentially mentioned, but I honestly feel like it was just plucked out of the book for marketing purposes because it's not really an important part of the story. Anyway, this is a book about a princess named Annalie who is one of 12 sisters, and her sisters all keep dying under mysterious circumstances. Everybody is whispering that it's a family curse, but Annalie knows that there has to be more than that to it. She begins to suspect foul play, so she takes it upon herself with the help of this boy named Cassius, whom she likes, to solve the mystery. Things I liked about this book was that I actually did think that the world building was pretty good. It's an entire like maritime kingdom that has all sorts of like seafaring lore and mythology and stuff, and I really liked that. I also really liked Verity, who was the creepy little kid that could see ghosts, because she was great and I loved her. Things I didn't like about this book was pretty much everything else. Like, Annalie as the main character really has no personality. I mean, like, she has a personality in the sense that everyone else is blonde and she has black hair, but that's about it. And also Cassius, the love interest, literally just exists to be a love interest because it seems like that's the like cookie cutter trope for YA fantasies. It's like, hey, we have a girl in a YA fantasy, guess we have to put in this boy to be a love interest. I thought that was all he was there for, but then at the end, like, he actually becomes kind of important, but in such a way that wasn't set up at all during the book, so it really read like this irritating Deus Ex Machina, and I did not like this. I was kind of shouting about it a bit in the Mythtaker Discord as I was finishing it, just going, oh no, oh no. So this book relied way too heavily on a bunch of my least favorite tropes, and I kind of ended up hate reading the last third of it because I was like, I just want to be done with this. I don't want to still be reading this anymore. So the less said about that, the better, I think. Then I finished reading a novella, which was The AI Who Loved Me by Alyssa Cole. Y'all know that, like, I am rapidly becoming an Alyssa Cole stan. I am reading, like, all of her books that I can get my hands on. Well, really, I'm just reading all of the novellas. I know I need to read the full-length novels, but this one is no exception, and this is a pretty cool story about a girl living in the future, like, near-ish technological future, that starts falling in love with this AI. This actually has, some disability rep, as our main character is recovering from an accident that leaves her with a lingering injury that causes her a fair amount of like physical pain and some mobility issues. And it was just real fun to read. I enjoyed it a lot. I always like it when like my romance has a touch of social commentary in it, and Alyssa Cole's romances are always like that without fail, so I really appreciated that. Okay, so the next two I read for the Queer Blackathon, which was a 48-hour readathon that happened starting on Juneteenth. And the first book that I finished was the audiobook of Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar, which just hit me in the gender feels in all of the ways. It follows Felix, who is this teenage boy about to enter his senior year of high school. He is transgender and has undergone a fair amount of physical transition while in high school, and then ends up getting outed with a bunch of people, or with somebody who posts a bunch of pictures of him before he transitioned and before he changed his name, and basically like spreading all of this stuff with like his dead name on it and the way that he used to look before he transitioned. And he doesn't know who it is. He has a suspicion of who it is, but he is not really able to prove anything. So this book is kind of like him trying to solve the mystery of who outed him like that, but it also deals with him falling in love with, I'm not gonna say because like you just need to read the book, and also continuing to like question his gender and not like be fully settled in a binary trans sort of narrative the way that he thought he might be at the beginning. So what I really appreciated about this book, aside obviously from like all of the great representation, it's just like, yeah, Felix is a black trans boy, and that is just who he is, and he is very proud about it. It is awesome. But what I also really liked about the representation was that it gave us a protagonist who like knows that they're trans, but is still not 100% sure of what their gender is, and they're still kind of like questioning. Like Felix is still questioning because he feels like a guy some of the time, but not all of the time. And it's basically about him trying to find a home for himself, like among queer labels and stuff like that. I think this book actually had some really good things to say about like the importance of labels in terms of being able to find who you are within a community, but also like you take what you need from labels, and like you don't need to necessarily identify 100% one way all of the time. So I really appreciated this handling of like questioning and being in flux and like demi-gender type stuff as totally valid, because hello, that's kind of where I hang out in terms of gender stuff. So this book was really great. Obviously, it does come with some content warnings for typical like transphobic stuff, because that's a major part of the plot. So just be aware of that going in, but it is absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed the audiobook. Next up, I read Don't Call Us Dead, which is the first poetry collection by Dinez Smith. I've been meaning to read their book Homie, but my library doesn't have it. And then I was watching one of Jen Campbell's videos where she recommends, I think it's 30 books by Black poets. I'll have it linked down below. But she talks about hearing Dinez Smith read from their book and read the poem Dinosaurs in the Hood. And I was like, oh yeah, my library does have this book. So I ended up checking it out and reading it for the Queer Blackathon. It was great. I always find it really difficult to review and talk about poetry collections, but I think like one of the things that I really appreciated about Dinez Smith's writing is the way in which they are so economical with their words, but it seems like the fewer words they use to write the poems, the greater and more evocative and more disturbing, honestly, like the imagery of their poetry is. So this is a collection of poems that is a lot about like the joy of Black boys, the sorrow of being a Black boy. There's a lot of poems that deal with police violence and police brutality. There are a lot of poems that also deal with the poet's HIV positive diagnosis, which I didn't figure out until I had read a few of them. And then I went, oh shit, and I had to go back and reread them, like with that knowledge, having figured out these are poems about HIV. And this was just like, this wasn't a poetry collection that was written for me, if you know what I'm saying. Like, I'm not really the target audience here, but I'm really grateful that I just got to read it and listen to these poems and experience what this author was going through when they wrote them. So I would highly recommend that you check this out. It is a very intense, heavy poetry collection, but absolutely wonderful. And I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Let's see, what's the last book? Oh, right. The last book that I read was Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House by Elizabeth Keckley. This is actually a memoir by Elizabeth Keckley, who was an enslaved woman who was born into slavery in the United States shortly before the Civil War, who got out of slavery, started her own dressmaking business, and eventually became, I think most famously, the dressmaker for Mary Todd Lincoln during Lincoln's presidency and then thereafter. So this is her memoir about her experiences being born enslaved in the South and growing up, freeing herself from slavery, becoming her own businesswoman, supporting people both Black and white financially, and really like going to this position of power where like she was quite literally both the only woman and the only Black person in the room to see Lincoln's body right after he was assassinated. She was there with the cabinet and the generals and all of these like important bigwig people, and she was there. And I read this book because it was mentioned in a different nonfiction book that I'm reading, which is called From Slave Cabins to the White House. That is about African-American women and homemade citizenship. So it was on a chapter about how Black women have traditionally been excluded from the like white dominated narratives of true womanhood and the cult of domesticity. These are all like Victorian ideas that kind of idealize women as like these angels in the house and like these people that are just pure and virtuous and good, and their goodness like extends to their homes. And so the author of From Slave Cabins to the White House is talking about how Black women who were traditionally excluded from these predominantly white narratives didn't really care because they were busy making their own homes and their own like homemade citizenship and such. And as I'm going through this nonfiction book, there are a fair number of narratives, like slave narratives, which are sort of like autobiographical, but also kind of novel-like at the same time. And also some early like 19th, early 20th century novels that are mentioned in the book. So I'm like, okay, well, I want to read this nonfiction book, but I want to go back and read all of the fiction books that the author is talking about so like I can understand her arguments better. So that's why I read Behind the Scenes. I thought that this story was absolutely incredible. I think that it makes a lot of sense to read it and then like read the chapter where the author talks about it in conversation with Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which is another narrative about slavery and like being born into it and then coming out of it and making your life on your own terms. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars because I think it is really well written and also a masterpiece historically, and also I really want to learn more about Elizabeth Keckley. She's a little bit sparse on the personal details of her life in this book, and they go into why that is. You know, basically this whole thing about like the focus of the story is not meant to be like the trauma porn of being a Black woman who was enslaved. So like she's kind of sparing on the personal details because she's trying to talk more about like her power and her prestige and stuff like that. And so she ends up exposing the more traumatic events of the white family, the Lincolns, that she works for as like this way of turning the tables. So I want to learn more about her personal life. I'm sure that she left more behind in letters and writings and all that stuff. So like I said, 5 out of 5. I also played a new video game this week, which was a lot of fun. It is called Later Daters, and it is a visual novel dating sim type game where you play as an old person and you get to date other old people. Yeah, so the first part of the game is out now. It's going to be released in installments as far as I know. So the first part of the game is like a few hours maybe. And this game slaps. Like, I love this game. You get to play as an old person. Like I said, the game is extremely diverse in terms of races represented, genders, sexualities, all of these other things. I think like it's awesome that we have more games with elder protagonists. Like, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, oh my god, I'm so tired of like reading books and playing games where it's like, yeah, it's always people in their late teens, early 20s. And I'm like, you know, other people have lives, right? Like, I want to read more books about old people, and I want to play more games where old people are the protagonists. So I really enjoyed this. It was still like the very early stages of the game, so I didn't really get too much into any specific characters. But I'm really liking it. I got it for the Nintendo Switch. I think it was like $7 on the eShop or something like that. And like I said, like it's got hella queer representation. I really like it. Like there's actually like a canonically asexual character. There's a canonically polyamorous character. I think maybe there's like 2 white people out of a cast of 10. So like that's pretty cool too, because again, a bunch of these games tend to be really white. So that was my experience playing Later Daters. I cannot wait for the like later chapters of Later Daters to come out. And I think that's gonna do it for this week's Geekly wrap up. So if you like this video and you'd like to see more of what I do, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. That's the best way to get updates every time I post a new video. As always, thank you all so very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.